Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first time speaking on stage after 5 years, since before COVID. So I grew up in New Hampshire, in Nashua, and I raised my kids in New Hampshire. And I've never been to PorcFest before, but the funny thing is I moved to Miami 4 years ago. And I flew all the way here from Miami to be here. So this is my first time back on stage after a hiatus, and it's such an honor to be here with you all. Thank you so much, Constance, for having me, and for everyone that brought me here. My husband is with me, my husband Viggy. It's his first time ever seeing me speak publicly, so it's very special. So thank you for that wonderful intro. I never planned on being an advocate for the life that I lead. It just happened very organically. It all began when I gave birth to my first son, my son Devin. So I have 4 kids. I have a 16-year-old son, Orion, a 19-year-old daughter, Ivy, a 22-year-old daughter, well, her name is Dakota legally, but she changed her name to Tiffany. And my son, Devin, is 25, so 2 boys and 2 girls. And I started this path in such a unique way. I wanted a natural birth. I never thought I could have one. I was so afraid of pain, but I did. I had a midwife, and I had a wonderful natural birth in a hospital. And motherhood changed my life. When I was holding Devin for the first time, I couldn't believe the emotions I felt. And giving birth to him naturally unleashed something in me. I was reborn when he was born. And I thought about things I had never thought about before. And so everything began for me when I was nursing him a couple hours after he was born, and the nurses of the hospital came running in the room, and they turned on the television, and everybody was yelling and running around saying, something's happening, and she turned on the TV, and the Columbine shootings were happening live. And so it was a crazy moment where I had just brought forth life, and I was watching mothers crying because they were losing their children, and children were screaming and jumping out of windows, and it was just such a moment of awareness for me. And it's when I started thinking about something I never really thought about before, was children's rights. And I thought to myself, how many of those parents and children would have preferred to have been home that day, wanted to be, but didn't know they could? And so I really wanted to parent my children in a way where they had the choice to go to school or not. So my choice to homeschool them wasn't because I was afraid they'd get shot. It wasn't a fear-based decision. It was more of a, they will always have the choice to go to school or not. And so they have always had that choice. They're very aware of what school was, and it was very different than our home life was, so I'm sure you're not surprised to hear they never chose school. But they were raised in a way that was also very unique to traditional homeschooling and traditional parenting in the authoritarian paradigm. So 99% of parenting books on the market are focused on meeting the parents' needs. The parents' needs for quiet, uninterrupted sleep, obedience, and compliance, and above all, behavior modification. I'm sure you guys have seen like the nanny shows on TV, and you've seen the focus on punishment, behavior modification. And it's really very, very different than how I chose to raise my kids, which happened really naturally. So when I gave birth to Devin, I was home from the hospital with him, and my mother-in-law came down, and he started crying, and she said to me, you should put him in that bassinet that we got you. You shouldn't hold him too much, because he'll manipulate you. He will cry, and you're going to have to hold him every time he cries. And I wanted her to approve of me and love me. You know, as women, we're raised as people pleasers. And so I was so nervous of her thinking I was a bad mom, so I did what she said, and I put him in the bassinet, and he started crying, and everything inside me was screaming to pick him up, but I let him stay there for a few minutes. Well, luckily she left right soon after, and I ran over and I picked him up, and I said, I'll never do that to you again, I'm so sorry. And I can remember sitting there crying, thinking to myself, wow, so I need to either choose for people to accept me or choose my child and their needs. And I said, well, this is gonna suck, but everyone's gonna think I'm crazy when I do this, but I care more about what my son thinks of me than what anybody else thinks of me. Now that's a powerful statement to make. Most parents in public, you see them getting very worried and embarrassed when their kids are acting up, and they care more about what other people think of them, what strangers think of them, than what their own kids think of them. But I'm somebody who likes to help change that, and I want parents to care more about what their kids think about them than anybody else. So what I was practicing when I gave birth was something called attachment parenting. I didn't even know it had a label, but practices of attachment parenting have to do with co-sleeping, baby wearing, all like the crunchy things. Even though I was not a hippie or thought of myself as a crunchy mom at all, I kind of fell into that category. I became a childbirth teacher and doula, and I had home births with my other 3 children, which is something I never thought I'd do. If you would have told me I'd be parenting this way and having home births before I had kids, I would have been like, are you kidding? I'm not one of those crazy hippies. Well, I guess I am now, but at the time I was judgmental of it. So I was never really a radical in school. I was a heavy metal lover. I hung out with the metalheads in school. I was kind of on the fringe, smoking cigarettes in the bathroom, things like that, skipping school. I never really liked it, but I was a really good student just because I could jump through hoops well. But what we're doing, what I'm promoting here is something called unschooling, and what I wrote a book about is called Radical Unschooling. And so unschooling means living life as though school doesn't exist. Now, a lot of people hear the term unschooling and they think it's uneducating. It's really important for you guys to understand that distinction. It's not uneducating. It's not doing the trappings of school. No forced curriculum, no tests, no workbooks. So my kids have been raised, all of them, without ever doing anything schooly. They've never done a workbook page. They've never taken a test. They've never gone through any kind of curriculum whatsoever, but yet they're happy, functioning people with careers they love. And it's so nice to be to this point of it because I've been in the media a lot in the last 15 years or so. The Dr. Phil show was the first appearance that I was on, and I think it was 17 years ago. And my kids were little then. I hadn't even had my 4th child, and so everything I was talking about was philosophically, what I thought would happen based on other people living this life and my trust in them. And Dr. Phil did not agree with this life, by the way. He thought I was crazy. I wish he'd have me back on, and I want him to meet my kids now because he was wrong about everything. He was wrong about everything. I knew he was at the time. But the interesting thing is I was in the media for 10 years, I'd say straight, on all different shows. And I still can't believe people had me on talking about a lifestyle that's so intuitive to me. I don't think of it as radical. This is really natural. This is how I parented from my heart. What I think is unnatural is forcing a child in timeouts or punishing them or spanking them or hurting them and getting them to obey. To me, that's the most unnatural thing that you could do for another human being. It models that power rules. And if children learn what they live, what they learn from those kind of punishments is when you're bigger than somebody, you can force them to do what you want. And so what happens when we parent in partnership is we focus on the needs under the behavior. And in doing so, you're modeling that everybody's needs matter equally. And to me, that's a really wonderful way to model how to treat others. And it has worked out in that way. It wasn't just a philosophical fingers crossed. It really has worked out that way. My kids have grown to understand that. So that is really beautiful. So unschooling. Now, I never knew it had a label. In the same way my children learned to walk and talk is how they learned to read and write. Now, it's hard to believe because we've been really, really lied to. And you don't realize how much deep conditioning that you have to see things in the way that schools have brainwashed you to see them. To seeing life broken down into subjects. To seeing things as very, very important to learn at certain windows of time. And that schools are the only place that you can learn these things. Well, it's the biggest lie, especially now. There's so many better ways to learn. Schools are such a caveman source of learning compared to what there is available today. And everything is so outdated. And so schools want you to think that you need them, that you're dependent on them. And that starts actually with hospital birth as well. Hospitals make parents really dependent on experts and authorities. And when a woman can't birth naturally, and she's given a vicious cycle of interventions, it can really undermine her confidence when she thinks that she couldn't do it herself without these experts. And that leads you down a path of trusting and relying on experts. And so parents oftentimes are really nervous to parent their child outside of school because they don't think that they're capable. They think they need certified teachers and different things like that, but it's not true. So I'm not my child's teacher as an unschooling parent. I'm not the all-knowing authority pouring knowledge into them. But what I am instead is their learning facilitator. So my role as their learning facilitator is to bring as many resources into their life to learn and grow from based on whatever they're interested in at the time. So although we don't break life down into subjects, so this is part of the deschooling part, you really have to stop seeing things broken down into subjects. And instead you see that real life and learning happens every day all around us. You couldn't keep a child from learning if you tried, especially in this day and age. Learning is everywhere. And so we don't break life down into subjects, but if you were to break our life down into subjects, the way that I facilitate their interests does touch on every subject. So I'll give you an example. When Devin was 4 or 5 years old, he really loved Legos. And so when your child's interested in something, this is how you facilitate their learning. I subscribed to Lego magazine, so he'd be surrounded with a written word and really internally motivated to want to learn more through the written word. We made a Lego cake, which touched on math. He did the measurements for it. We went to a Lego exhibit in Manchester, New Hampshire. Actually, they have the mill used to do like a real-life mill exhibit, which touched a lot on history. And so with every interest my kids have had, I'll bring as much into their life to learn and grow from, and they learn so much as a side effect, and it's all really joyful. Learning is easy and pleasurable when it's not forced. So that brings me to my next point. Forced learning is not learning. It's not true learning. And it's very unjust to force a human being to learn something you think is good for them when they don't want to be learning it. How would you feel if you guys didn't want to be listening to me right now, and you were tied to this chair, and you were told you're going to be punished and have things taken away if you didn't listen to everything I had to say? Not only that, but you have a test afterward. It would feel terrible. You wouldn't want to learn it. Well, that's how children feel every day when they're forced in school. So this is about consensual learning. It's about understanding that forced learning is not kind, and nor is taking tests. To pry into another human being's mind against their will, to try to excavate knowledge and to see what they know, for one, it's never accurate as to what somebody really knows, and for two, it's very unjust. And so I want to invite you to start thinking about things in a different way when it comes to learning. And so my children have always had the freedom to learn what they want, however they want to learn it. Now, some unschoolers choose school. I have some friends who have one child, like a single child, and they want more of a social connection. So this philosophy isn't necessarily anti-school. It's more about children's rights and freedom to choose. Most kids do not choose school, but some will if the benefits outweigh the negatives for them. They usually don't last very long, in my experience, that they'll try it and say, oh, this isn't really worth it to me. There's too much negative here. But my children always had the freedom to choose it or not. So again, part of this role is the hardest thing, I think, is for us parents. Kids come to this life really easy. Kids come to unschooling very naturally. It's us who have to go through the process of deschooling and healing from our own childhood to really be able to parent this way and to trust ourselves and trust in our ability to facilitate our child's education. So something really important I want to point out that a lot of people may have never thought about before is that it's not true freedom if you have to ask permission from an institution to spend time with your child. If you have a child in school, you are not free. You will be punished, your child will be punished if you want to spend time with them during school hours. And I would never wanted that part of our life. And it never has been part of our life. Unschooling is also about reprioritizing. When you have a child in school, you need to put the needs and the agenda of the school first and foremost. And you also have to be somebody who pushes the agenda of the school to your child. For example, enforcing homework, enforcing bedtime so they can wake up on time, enforcing so much that the school, that authorities have conditioned you and feared you into enforcing in your own home with your own kids. So reprioritizing and living this life means that you choose to put family and connection and pursuing your passions together before anything. Education is not the goal of unschooling. That sounds crazy, I know, but hear me out. Education does happen, but as a side effect of reprioritizing and the first priorities of family connection and pursuing your passions together and living in freedom. When you put that priority first, education happens. It just happens. Your kids will learn everything they need to learn. And it's important to understand, though, this is not a neglectful or permissive role. And some people really mistake unschooling for that. How many of you have felt that before, that unschooling is really neglectful or permissive? I probably would have thought that the first time I heard about it if I hadn't really understood the philosophy. And so it's not for the lazy parent, because when your kids are interested in something, you need to be there to facilitate what they want to learn and grow from. And that takes time and patience and getting creative. Let's see. Let's need a break here. Oh, it's really hot, isn't it? Holy moly. I thought Miami was hot. So we don't live life also, it's important to realize that this is a twofold philosophy. Unschooling is an educational philosophy, but it's also a parenting one. And so we don't live in the authoritarian paradigm with our kids. So we don't live by rules and punishments. But people want to know, what do you do instead? What could you possibly do instead of those things? And what we do instead is we're present with our kids. Rules are a replacement for being present with your children. Now that's kind of a heavy thing to think about, but I'm going to give you an example of how this plays out so you can understand in real life. So my son Devin, when he was 4 years old, he wanted to play with matches. He saw us lighting fires, and he was so interested in it. And I remember telling my mother, oh, Devin wants to play, check out matches. She said, oh, you better forbid that. Don't ever let him touch matches. He's only 4. And I said, well, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be with him. And she was like, oh, well, okay, I guess it's okay then. And so we would sit in the cellar, and I showed him how to safely light a match, and he would spend hours. We would sit down there, and he would light in our wood furnace fires, and he had so much fun doing it. And I told him, whenever you want to do that, let me know, and we'll go down. I had the matches in a safe spot. And so that evolved to him lighting candles and him learning how to build fires in the snow. And he became such an incredible passion. He had such an incredible passion for fire that it led to him becoming a blacksmith, a professional blacksmith, making knives and swords and selling them on Etsy. Also, I found a fire mentor for him in Australia when I spoke there, and he had somebody teach him how to do fire poi, which led him to teaching others how to do fire poi. And I always think back to the time where my mother said, oh, you're crazy. Why would you let a child so young play with fire? But what she didn't understand, because this is something most people don't comprehend and don't think about, is you can say yes to so much with your kids that most parents would say no to if you're there and present with them to make sure they're safe. And this is where most people get so thrown off about the philosophy, is like they don't understand that part. And so I was able to say yes to a lot of things by being present with them. I was able to say yes to the first concert my daughter Ivy wanted to go to when she was 11, and we went to see Marilyn Manson. Another thing I was very much criticized for, it was also the first book she ever read, was Marilyn Manson's autobiography. Now, before she read it, she said to me, Mom, will you please tell me the pages that they talk about sex stuff, because I don't want to read any of that. And so I said, all right, sure. And so I put little Post-its on these pages. He talks a little bit about that. You probably don't want to read that. She said, thank you, that's gross. I don't want to read that. And so, it's interesting because when your kids trust you, when you're not in the authoritarian paradigm and you're not controlling them and limiting them and punishing them, you have a very different relationship with your kids than somebody who does. So part of this life is really thinking back to what it felt like to be the age that your child's at. It's so important, and parents don't do this enough. Think back to what it felt like to be 6 and what it felt like to be 8 and 10 and 15. When I think back to those days, I'm able to parent from so much more compassion and understanding than when I get in this role, when people put themselves in this role of the authority. My role is not to train my children to be good people. It's not to punish them and control them and fear them into doing what I want. When I parent from the authoritarian paradigm and do that, it externally motivates them to behave in certain ways. But that's not what I'm looking to create. I'm not looking to create obedient kids that when authorities are looking, you do what they want, and then you be a totally different person behind closed doors. Parenting this way means that I want them to have inherent goodness, and so we live by principles. I want them to have true motivation to be the kind of people that they want to be, as opposed to fearfully behaving in a certain way. Can you guys remember times when you were a child where you ended up doing things you didn't want to do? You became somebody you didn't want to become because of authority and control, whether it was cheating on a test or sneaking alcohol, or there's a number of things. You became somebody you didn't want to be. And I know with me, because I had to do that to have my freedom. So all humans want freedom above all else. We're wired to want freedom. And when a child's freedom is threatened, or their property is threatened, being grounded or having things taken away, you do what you got to do to survive, and you become somebody you don't want to be. To have those basic needs met, to expect a child to put your need for obedience over their inherent needs to explore and experience is such an unrealistic expectation. And so when you're able to come from a place of having compassion, understanding for your kids, you're able to be able to meet their needs in such a different way. And I'm happy to answer any questions. People always have questions come to their mind, but what about this and what about that? And there's 100 different scenarios that I'm happy to share with you how I've handled those things. But putting yourself in your child's shoes is so important. Yeah, I'll answer in 1 second. People have such unrealistic expectations for kids. They expect them to act like adults. They expect them to never have moments of frustration and screaming. They're reprimanded and punished for behaviors that we, being in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, we can't even control after being alive that long, and we expect them to be able to control their emotions. And then we punish them when they can't. It's cruel and it's unfair, and it causes so much disconnect in the the parent-child relationship. And so what we're doing, those of us that are parenting this way, are putting the connection with our children first. The connection, the love, the patience, the kindness, and the compassion, and helping them meet their needs under their behavior. It's a very different way to parent. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have with this presentation. Thank you so much. Okay. Yes. No, that's also external motivation. Yep. Yeah, no, I'm glad that you asked that. Thank you for asking that question. So anybody that has any questions, please come up.
I wasn't quite unschooled, but I did have Waldorf parents and went to a Waldorf school my whole life. But who are your teachers? Who have you been reading? Who have you been learning from? Who's been supporting you?
Thank you so much for asking.
Because that would be so helpful to us.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for asking that question. So I had a wonderful mentor. His name was John Taylor Gatto. He was like a father to me for many years. When we first connected, probably 14 years ago, probably 16 years ago, he encouraged me to write my first book, Radical Unschooling, A Revolution Has Begun. And John did not like computers. He was not a tech guy, so he would call me on the phone every single night at 8:30 p.m., and I was back with caller ID, and I'd look. Now, I didn't know that John was a big deal at all. He was just this wonderful man who was mentoring me, and he'd call, and I'd have 4 kids. I'd have a 6-week-old, a 2-year-old, and they'd be screaming in the background, and he'd be like, Dayna, you really have to write this book. Parents need to hear it. And he would call me every night to encourage me, and he gave me this wonderful raving review. And so John Taylor Gatto was actually one of my biggest influences. Also John Holt. John Holt coined the term unschooling in the 1970s. And it started as a joke, actually. Do you guys remember, those of you that are my age, like over 50, do you remember the Uncola with 7-Up? Yeah. So it's a joke name, actually. Unschooling was kind of a spin on the Uncola, and it just kind of stuck. Yeah, so John Holt and John Taylor Gatto, definitely my 2 biggest. Alfie Cohen, I really like Alfie Cohen's Unconditional Parenting. He goes really deep into the parenting side of this philosophy.
Just curious, did you ever discover Joseph Chilton Pierce?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, I do love him too. Yep. Thank you for asking.
Quick
Hi.
question.
Sure.
A lot of parents, a lot of kids say that they were treated a certain way and they deserved it. And what they received was discipline. What would you say to them?
That's a heavy question, isn't it? So I think it's easier to cope with the idea that you were, that is something that had to happen than to say to yourself, something better could have happened. It's a coping mechanism I think a lot of people say, and they really do believe it. A lot of people are really grateful for punitive discipline. But those are usually people who think the only option aside from control is complete permissiveness and neglect. And I remember feeling that way. I can remember my parents saying things to me about like the neighbors' kids who are left alone, like they're not loved because their parent doesn't punish them. How many times have you guys heard things like, this will hurt me more than it hurts you, and I'm doing this because I love you? Those are all really punitive things to say that helped condition us to believe that all of that was necessary. And so when I'm talking about this life, it could be really triggering for some people when they hear that another way was possible, because most people, all we know is control, punishment, the authoritarian paradigm, or the pendulum swinging completely in the other direction, complete neglect and permissiveness. This is neither of those things. This life is a very different approach. So I've heard many people say that. Yeah. People in the military say that too. Yeah. Okay. Hi.
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 This will hurt me more than it hurts you lie. My parents never tried that on me. I probably would have said, don't be a fool. Don't do it.
Yeah.
Why would you want to hurt yourself that way?
Yes, exactly.
But it sounds to me from what you're saying is you're all in favor of children making their own choices. Does that apply to their diet as well?
Great question, sir. So my kids have always had freedom of choice with their diets. We have gone through so much. We have been vegan. We were vegan for 10 years. We're not anymore. One of my daughters is. We've always facilitated and supported whatever our kids wanted to eat. When I was vegan, I was cooking steak for my son, who was carnivore at the time. So no agenda comes before my kids. So I'm happy to, they always had the freedom, and I'm happy to facilitate that. I had vegan activist friends saying, how could you even allow meat in your house? And I would say, my kids want it. There's no agenda that comes before that. So they've had the freedom to choose their own beliefs, their diet, their bedtimes.
Well, at some point you had to make some decisions, otherwise your kids would be eating nothing but candy.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So they've had freedom, yes. So this has to do with the paradigm of partnership and control. So let's talk about this for a minute. I'm glad that you brought this up. When you're not controlling your child all day, every day, and you have a different kind of relationship where they believe you and they trust you, when you give them information about foods, they take it in the same way. So imagine you were an exchange student, and you went over to Saudi Arabia, and the people you were staying with said, just so you know, it's really rude to show the soles of your feet around here, and they're giving you the information. You appreciate it. You're like, okay, thanks, good to know. They're not threatening you, saying, if you show the soles of your feet, you're going to be punished and put away. No, you're just talking and giving information. You appreciate it. So my kids we've had that approach with them. So we've talked about everything when it comes to diet, about sugar, about white flour, about dyes, about red dye number 40, about corn syrup. So when I tell my kids things, it's really important for me not to come from a place of fear to try to control them, but just give them honest information. I remember when my daughter Ivy was 9, I told her about high fructose corn syrup. We watched a couple of videos on it, we talked about it. So to this day, she reads labels and she won't buy anything with high fructose corn syrup in it. So kids want to be healthy. When you're controlling something and limiting it, say like with candy or things that are like bad for them, and there's varying beliefs on what those things are, but we probably all agree that candy is not the best thing. Chips, you don't want your kids eating that all day, every day. But when you're controlling those things, what happens is, back to the point that I made, that children, all humans have a innate desire for freedom above all else. And what happens is when you control these things, it causes an unnatural relationship with what's being controlled. And so their child wants their autonomy, they want their freedom, and so they will eat and consume more than they normally would if it wasn't being limited or controlled, as opposed to if they had freedom with it. With freedom comes balance for most people. For us, it's different because we're healing still. So if you're saying to yourself, I can't have control with things, well, yeah, we were raised in a different paradigm, which warped our relationship with so many things. But when you don't control things like foods, instead you give information and support, kids really do find balance. Yeah.
You said early on you're more concerned about what your child thinks of you than what other people think of you. I'm halfway with you there. I really don't care that much about what other people think, but as far as being a parent, in my view, I want my child to think when she's 21, oh, he did a good job. But along the way, there may be things we disagree about. And I think it's more important to be a parent than a friend. I've seen way too many people who call their kid buddy, and they're not being a parent at all. They're just wanting to be liked by this little person, and that's not the point, in my opinion.
Okay, that's a good point you bring up, because I've heard that a lot, that I'm not my child's friend, but I am my child's friend. And I'll tell you the difference is most people think of friendship with their child, maybe in a way you're remembering it when you were a kid, when you went over somebody's house and the mother wanted to be the cool mom and bought the kids alcohol and partied with their kids. I think people have in their minds that that's what like a friend is. That's not what I mean. I'm a trusted confidant. I'm somebody that they can count on. So I am their friend as much as their parent in the way that I believe true friendship should be.
Well, I'm not saying I don't want my kids to think I'm their friend. I'm saying that there's more to it being a parent.
Yes, I agree. So I love what you're saying, because so as a parent, I'm somebody that they turn to. I'm a mentor. I'm somebody who's leading. I'm not in a space where I'm an authority over them, but they turn to me as a trusted guide, as their mom, a nurturer, someone who takes care of them when they're sick, somebody that tells them when their next dental cleaning is, somebody, that arranges all these things. So you can be, it doesn't have to be an either or thing.
Use two different words in that answer, and use leading and guiding. And I tend to think more of the latter.
Okay.
I want my kids to go where they want to go. I'll try to guide them where they want to go, but I don't want them to think of me as the leader. I want them to be their own leaders.
I love that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Your answer to the question about sources was in terms of sources for unschooling. But part of the point of unschooling is that there's a whole world of information out there that the kids can use to educate themselves. And I was wondering if you could give examples. Some examples for our kids included the book How to Lie with Statistics, which they read very early and liked. The number of other books up to evolutionary biology, which they found interesting. And I was wondering what were examples of books that provided, as it were, the equivalent of a school education in the more entertaining and usually more nearly correct form of a good book.
Okay, well, some of my kids like to learn from books, but not all of them. So the learning resources are anything from the internet, all the different resources, classes, different things on the internet, to mentorships have been such a powerful thing in my children's lives. So when my kids have a passion or interest in something, finding sources online or finding sources in person for them to learn from. When you think of the people that were the most influential to you, or there are people that you listened to, that you learned from, that you met, so that is a great source of learning. Real life experiences, hands-on experiences. So no textbooks, but so many resources in the last 25 years. Yeah. Hi.
So I know, well, clearly it seems like you've been doing this since your kids were quite young, right? So,
yeah.
When you come to something like this, you think of, well, the kids are older, they're easier to talk to. And I find myself doing the don't jump off the stage and explaining to them why they should not jump off the stage, but I'm still kind of saying, hey, I asked you not to jump off the furniture, and we're talking to a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 7-year-old, and I am explaining why they should, because I don't want you to hurt yourself, because this is likely what could happen. And of course, that happens over and over again. Is it just a sense of repetition at those ages? Like, obviously it's very frustrating, but like, what would you have to, do you have like, I also have an issue with verbiage, right? Sometimes you kind of want to say things in a particular way to be more open about it instead of punitive. So I'm curious, like, what verbiage have you used when they're younger to sort of not seem authoritative, you know, like that?
Thank you so much for your question. So in that situation that you gave when my kids were that age, if they were jumping off the stage, so where I'm not controlling behavior, and in the authoritarian paradigm, I'm focused on the needs under their behavior. So if it was somewhere they shouldn't be jumping, I would say, what is their need? What's the need under their behavior? They have a lot of energy and they want to jump, so let me find a place for them to jump that's appropriate. We'll go to the playground, so I would excitedly say, let's go jump over here, and we'd go and meet their same need to jump somewhere else if it was not the best place for them to do it. So focusing on the needs under the behavior instead of explaining at an age where they can't really understand it. So there's something really important on this journey is to assume positive intent from your kids. We live in a culture that assumes negative intent. I can remember being so misunderstood as a child and being blamed for things that wasn't my intention. The assumption of negative intent is a poison in our culture. People feel that from us. I'm sure you feel it on a daily basis sometimes. And so when you assume positive intent, you're not looking at your children as trying to push your buttons and trying to do something to you. Instead, you're saying, what is their need? Let me help meet it in a way that respects everybody's needs. So it's not about letting a child do things that are trumping over somebody else's needs. The stage needs to be clear for speakers. The need of the organizers and the attendees are just as important as my child's need to jump. So finding another place to have those needs met so other people are respected are really important. I hope that answers your question. I'm happy to talk more to you about it. Okay. Hi.
Hello. So you teach our children to not hurt people, not take their stuff, don't be a bully. If they do it anyway, and you explain why it's a bad thing, but they keep doing it, what do you think is the appropriate response? Is there ever a role for punishment? And if so, in what way?
It's an interesting question, but that hasn't happened in my experience with my children. If I've explained something to them, I've never been in that situation where they kept stealing something from somebody if I talked to them about it. So I think that a lot of those behaviors that you might think would continue wouldn't exist if you parent from a place of peace and partnership. And so obviously if a child was having a problem with, it depends on the age. If the child was 2 and didn't really understand fully what was happening, I would try to find a way to meet their need. So it depends on the individual situation. If I had more context about the situation, I could answer, but is that good? I've never had to punish my kids for that, so I haven't been in that situation.
I have to say I'm jealous of your, well, yeah, first of all, of never having been in that situation, but I'll come back to that in a second because it's actually related to the questions that I was going to ask, but of your time with John Taylor Gatto. He was a mentor of mine. When I was young, I read Dumbing Us Down in 1991, and that changed the trajectory of my life. So I know his thinking is influential, and you had the right guy on your team. But the question I want to ask is a little bit philosophical. It's not unlike your question, and it has to do with sort of the philosophy of freedom. And the freedom to do things occasionally intersects other people's, let's say, equal freedom to do things, or we could say equal rights. So there's consequences when we violate other people's rights, and there should be some kind of consequence. As a parent, and I have 4 kids also, so I kind of, we have some parallel experiences. As a parent, we choose to have children, and then we choose to pour our lives into our kids and how we're going to parent them and all of that. And there's probably, if there's 20 parents in this room, there's 30 different ways of doing it. But other people, other parents, and other adults who don't have kids and other kids don't choose to pour their lives into our kids or any other person necessarily. They might, but to compel them to do so would be wrong. And so although I might sacrifice, and I think it is good to sacrifice to some extent, if the model is purely we expect everyone to choose sacrificially, that model is in fact unrealistic. And back to the point of our kids doing things that, we said, well, this is wrong, it's immoral or something like that. You stole don't hit your sister. I've literally said that before. That they might choose that repeatedly, and I'm thrilled to hear that you never had that experience. But in the course of raising kids this way, how do we transition when they're young and simply cannot comprehend human rights to that level? How do we transition to adulthood where, having modeled a very high level of sacrifice, they learn then to respect other people's rights? And as a tangential question, as parents even, we are people too, and to what extent do we protect ourselves from our kids? For example, don't wreck the couch, I just bought it, or whatever, pick an example that you like. So how do you integrate that into your philosophy of raising kids?
Thank you. So I can answer both of these questions a little bit more articulately. So there's real life boundaries all around us, and there's real life limitations. We don't need to create arbitrary limits within our home to teach kids that there are limits and laws and punishments in the real world. They learn it from living life by our side and through exploring the world. Natural consequences happen. If you keep stealing your friend's toy, they're not going to want to play with you anymore. You're going to be alone on that playground. You could call that a punishment, I guess, if you want to. It's not really, it's more of a natural consequence. So these situations happen in life with my kids where we talk about things like this. And so we don't need to create an artificial world of punishments and rewards in our homes for kids to learn and prepare them for the real world, because they're living life by my side and they're seeing, if I speed, I'm getting a ticket. They saw that. They saw we need to stand in line at the grocery store. They see through conversation and discussion that there are laws and rules in the world that if we go into the library, we need to be quiet. If you want to talk and be loud and disturb somebody, we got to go. These kind of things. So my children don't expect the world to cater to them in the way you might think. People think this is a very indulgent form of parenting, and it's not. It's a very practical, realistic, natural way to parent and give information. This doesn't mean that my children, any whim they have, they're given and they're going to get in the real world and be so lost because no one else is doing that. My kids are more prepared for the real world because they've been in it since day one. My kids aren't locked up in a brick building all day, every day for 12 years away from the real world. They're in the real world with me, learning by my side. So everything that parents are hoping to teach their kids through an authoritarian paradigm, children learn in a much better, more gentle way through discussion, through given information that if you do that, sweetie, you're going to hurt this person. If you do that, we're going to have to leave. They're going to kick us out. You're not going to have friends if you treat them this way. You're going to feel like crap if you eat 12 bags of chips. Giving them information and letting them experience it and keeping them safe. That is the best preparation, not becoming the authority and having a little mini microcosm of the real world in your house with arbitrary limits and rules just to teach them that. It's pointless to do it. When you have a relationship of trust and connection with your kids, they are so much safer, you're so much more influential in their life, and they're truly happier and more connected with you. Thank you. Yes?
So earlier you said that rules are for absent parents. Well, what about, like, say if a parent's working, multiple jobs full time and is there a compromise point, or is there a way to do unschooling halfway? Or how do you not violate your beliefs and principles if you don't have time to be there full time for your kids?
So there's lots of ways. I have a lot of single parents that connected me that want to unschool. There's co-ops, there's groups of people that homeschooling is so accepted now compared to when I started 25 years ago. The fact that there's so many different groups that you can connect with and do child care exchanges. It's hard finding people that parent this way, though, sometimes. Most of the child care out there is pretty punitive and authoritarian, but more and more people are offering this kind of support. So there's lots of ways to go about it. I'm happy to share with you some resources. Connecting with other unschoolers in your area would be great. All right, I have time for just another question or two.
Dayna, thank you so much for being here. One of the things that I practice with my kids is storytelling. So I found that when I'm trying to explain, we play with action figurines and I ask them things like, hey, what would you do if this happened? Can we try to kind of act it out? And I kind of bring up consequences and big ideas in this way. But what I've found with my oldest is she said, you know, when I go over to such and such house, that's really not what happens. And I'm kind of uncomfortable, and I find her withdrawing occasionally from the world outside of our community in a way. How would you handle that? Because this is also new, where our kids are growing up in, you know, kind of a nice little cocoon in a way, right? But how do we help them sort of balance and adjust to the world outside? Or should we, I mean, obviously we want the world outside to be more like ours, but, you know.
I mean, it's not easy, as you know, even when we're out as adults, to see most people don't have the beliefs that we have. It is sad and lonely at times to live this way and to parent this way. So I think empathizing with our kids when it comes to sharing and being confused. I can remember once my son Devin, he was jumping on the trampoline, and we had a neighborhood friend whose child was in school around the same age, and he came over and he was jumping on the trampoline and he ripped it. And he said, oh my gosh, don't tell your mom, don't tell your mom, don't tell your mom. And my son Devin said, why? She'll fix it. Like, I don't understand. And he was like, please don't tell, I'll get in trouble, I'll get grounded, please don't tell my mom. And he was crying, and Devin was like, I'll get my mom, she'll help us, she'll just fix it. And in that moment afterward, Devin's like, why did he act like that? It's so weird. You know, and I said, well, I had to explain it to him. There's a lot of discussion explaining that of the authoritarian paradigm and the focuses of kids. And I mean, as your kids get older, you just share that people do things differently. And your kids will naturally want to be around certain people and not want to be around certain people. My kids all have been through that, where they saw two sides of kids, like teenagers that would come over. My daughter Tiffany would tell me, you know, kids that were in school or parented punitively, she would say, the second you left, they acted totally different. It was so weird. Why does that happen? And I said, that happened to me too. You become two different people. You become the one the adults and authorities see, and then you become the one that everybody else sees. And so explaining that kind of phenomenon to kids is part of walking this path. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
All right, I do have a question, but I'm going to lead with a huge thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm on my year of producing.
Thank you.
My 4 children are slightly younger than Dayna's, and they have hugely benefited from your activism. So I know, like you said, you didn't mean to become an activism, but thank you for doing it. And I think there's probably other people here whose kids have benefited from that. So I'd like us all to thank you for that. And then my question is, are we meeting the kids next year?
My kids?
Yes.
Well, this is my first time coming, and I said to Vicky the other night when we first got here, I'm like, the kids have to come. They have to see this. Yeah, so I'd love for them to come next year.
I hope they do.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everybody.